right, let us do a little review on the first part of the second book of the Yoga Sutras, so Pada 2. So the first section of Pada 2 where we formally were introduced to the Kleshas, and we learned how they operate our mind, whether they're dormant or weakened, intermittent, or fully activated. The Kleshas are the root causes of all the karma, our entanglement with the afflictions. So the Kleshas are our ignorance, or forgetting that we are divine beings, our ego, the labels that we place on ourselves, our resistance to what is happening, our attachment to what's happening or what we like, and then our fear of change. So those are the Kleshas that impact the second section of the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras, which is all about the karma that we talked about last week. So Patanjali explains that these afflictions, the Kleshas, drive the cycle of karma. They're essentially actions that we've done in the past or actions that we're currently doing. Actions from the past that impact the present and actions in the present that impact the future. And then also actions that are just living dormant, ready to be activated, essentially the fruits of our actions. And so Patanjali prescribes Kriya Yoga, the yoga of action, consisting of tapas. That's our discipline, our svadhyaya, our self-study, and Ishvari Pranadhana, our surrender to the fact that we are all divine beings, or the consciousness that is bigger than just our individual selves, as tools to be used to weaken the Kleshas if they're activated. And then the next section of sutras that we'll look at today, 2.15 to 227, essentially zoom in on the exact mechanism of these afflictions. So by understanding that all worldly experiences are causing our suffering, our parinama, tapa, samskara. We've talked about samskaras, you've all got it, the ruts, the grooves that we have in our consciousness, essentially. Different than samsaras, which is like the repetitive loops that we get in because of these grooves. So we're zooming in on how these experiences cause suffering because of our ego's attachments, because of our ego's aversions, because of our ego's fear of change. And so then as a yogi practicing, we can learn to recognize that there is an urgent need for discriminative wisdom, Viveka, described in the verses that we'll look at today. So, let's see here. Okay, so Yoga Sutras 215 to 227, they are outlining essentially the mechanics of our human suffering, the dukkha, D-U-H-K-H-A. And then these sutras also provide the philosophical blueprint for Kavalya, liberation. The specific progression of verses, these sutras, you can think of them like a medical model of yoga. So we'll define the disease of suffering, its cause, the prognosis, and that healing is possible. And then these sutras will guide us through the prescription for a cure. Then the cure is liberation, Kavalya. So here's how these verses break down and also how they connect to the Kleshas that we talked about in the first part of the second book of the Yoga Sutras. So the first two we'll talk about are sutras 215 and 216. So the premise of suffering. Sutra 215 states that to a wise person, all life experience is suffering. So this occurs because of the pain of change. It also occurs from acute anxiety. It occurs from our habits and our subconscious impressions, the samskaras. And the suffering happens because of the constant conflict with the qualities of nature, the guna, vritti, viroda. And then Sutra 216 delivers a famous proactive promise, that's great, that future suffering can be avoided. So we can step off the hamster wheel of suffering if we're intentional. So the sutra is basically connecting back to the sutras about the Kleshas 2.3 to 2.9. And Sutra 215 explains why the Kleshas, the mental afflictions, hurt so badly. And the mental friction caused by raga, our attachment to pleasure, that's the klesha about attachment to pleasure. The friction between raga, our attachment to pleasure, and devesha, our aversion from pain, basically causing us to fear the change, and which is the parinama, and then the tapa, the anxiety. Because external conditions are always shifting. So when we're attached to this feeling good, we're resisting what's feeling bad, is causing us suffering. It's causing this friction that is, basically keeping us from our happiness. And then Sutra 1.2, we'll go way back to the first chapter, the second sutra. Patanjali defined yoga as the calming, the stilling of the mind's fluctuations, chitta vritti nirodha. And so that's what, we have all these thoughts happening, our resistance, our aversions. That's chitta vritti. That's the fluctuations of the mind. Bringing us back to Sutra 215, that is explaining what happens if we fail to calm the fluctuations of the mind. So the gunas, the forces of nature that we've talked about, the rajas, sattva, spacing on the third one, tamas. If we fail to calm the fluctuations of the mind, and then we have these clashing forces of nature creating constant mental turbulence, then we're going to be in the experience of suffering. So this next two sutras in this section of Yoga Sutras, 217 and 218, the causes of suffering are because the seer and the seen get confused. 217 identifies the root cause of pain is the confusion between the seer, the purusha, the pure consciousness, and the seen, the prakriti, which is the material world, and that material world includes the mind. So when we get confused between, we think that we are the thing we're seeing, then we're in the experience of suffering. And then Sutras 218 to 222, we'll kind of group these all together, describe the nature of the seen. Not seen like S-C-E-N-E, which I guess it could be that, but like what we're seeing with our eyes, S-E-E-N. The physical world exists purely to serve consciousness through experience, boga. And ultimately, liberation, apavarga. While the world is intensely real, to the unenlightened mind, its binding power disappears once we wake up. Once we see how powerful we are as consciousness rather than as material beings, then we experience freedom. But to the unenlightened mind, we're just fully merged with this experience and fully merged with the suffering. And we can connect these ones back to the earlier sutras about the Kleshas 2.4 and 2.5 avidya, where it's talking about avidya is our ego's labels, and it blocks us. Just kidding. Avidya is our ignorance, and it blocks us from remembering our divinity. So it's the root klesha. It's the basic reason we suffer is because we forget that we're divine beings. And mistaking this transient experience in this material world as permanent. And experiencing this impure, not pure consciousness, but this human consciousness as pure. So then Sutra 217 applies the definition directly to the soul, and you suffer because you mistake your changing body and mind as who you are, when really who we are is the seer, not the seen. And then tying this back to the first chapter of the sutras, 1.3 and 1.4, So remember, 1.1 is the practice of yoga is now, like all that exists is right now. The second one is yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. And then 1.3 and 1.4 from chapter 1, Patanjali states that when the mind is quiet, the seer rests in its true nature. Otherwise, the seer identifies with the thoughts, which is 1.4. So back to Sutras 217 to 222 that are explaining the exact cosmic mechanism behind that identification. It's explaining why we over-identify with this material human experience. And then the third section of this part of the sutras, the purpose of the alliance, Sutras 223 to 225, explain the Samyoga, our kind of connection between consciousness and the material world and why it's happening. It's interestingly enough, the sutras are saying this is happening so that we can see the true nature of both, so that we can see the true nature of this human experience, but that we can, because of the contrast, essentially, then we can see the true nature of our divinity. So if we weren't having this human experience, we wouldn't have the contrast awareness of the divine nature. Does that make sense? It's like we need this human experience. We need this like tangible thing that feels and sees and thinks, so we can have the contrast to be able to see or know or remember our divinity. And then Sutra 225 concludes that when the ignorance or when the belief that we are merged with the human experience, like we are forever tied to the human experience, when that ignorance is destroyed, the alliance dissolves and we can be the seer witnessing the human experience. We can be the divine consciousness witnessing, seeing, being present to what's happening. And when we can separate ourselves from this experience of being human, we feel a sense of divinity, connection to the wholeness of all that is, which is Kavalya, liberation. We can tie this back to Sutra 2.6, Asmita, the ego, not avidya, that was the forgetting that we're divine. So Asmita 2.6, the klesha of egoism, I amness, is the psychological glue of that alliance. So Asmita is like the mental knot that I talked about in the meditation. Asmita is the, I guess like the shoelaces, tying the two shoes together. Oh, that's a good maybe metaphor analogy, that like we have two shoes and if they're tied together, then we stumble through life and we're going to trip over ourselves. But if we can remember that there is a human experience, yes, but we are divine beings, we can untie the knot. And so then we can move through life without tripping over ourselves and suffering. And 226 is saying that the remedy is unbroken discrimination. What does that even mean? 226 gives us the ultimate remedy, uninterrupted discriminative awareness. Viveka Kyati. To stop suffering, you must constantly practice separating the seer from the seen, is what that means. Uninterrupted discriminative awareness. Practice separating the seer from the seen. And then 227 explains that a person who achieves this develops a sevenfold highest wisdom, meaning their mind achieves complete stable clarity in stages. Like the clarity just gets clearer and clearer and clearer. It's like we talked about the levels of samadhi. So uninterrupted discriminative awareness is constantly practicing separating the seer from the seen. And then when we can do that, when we can separate the seer from the seen, both are happening, both help us realize that contrast is important, then we can get to that experience of bliss. And this ties back to the sutras we talked about, 1.12, about abhyasa and virajya, where we talk about steady practice, the dedicated devotional practice, abhyasa, and the non-attachment to the results of that practice, virajya. So when we practice separating ourselves from the material experience, being a witness to this experience with devoted dedication and also without attachment to getting there, essentially, then we'll experience bliss. And then we have the transition to Ashtanga Yoga, Sutra 228 onwards. So right after establishing that Viveka Kyati is the cure, our practice of separating ourselves from the material experience and witnessing, basically from here forward, Patanjali realizes that human beings cannot just jump into perfect discrimination. So Sutra 228 introduces us to the 8 limbs of yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, as the practical tool to destroy the impurities and kindle this light of wisdom. So yoga as a clearing, a practice of clearing so that we can still the fluctuations of the mind and be in the experience of pure bliss, pure unbounded bliss. So, essentially we're just building on all of the things from chapter 1 in Patanjali's Sutras 1.1. Yoga is the practice now, stilling the fluctuations of the mind, and then all of the different layers. Today's lesson is essentially reminding us that as long as we're bound in this human experience, we're going to experience suffering. But the more we can practice untying that knot, separating ourselves, the seer and the seen, and we can use the contrast of the seen and the seer to recognize our divinity, then we'll be in the experience of liberation, which is blissful and definitely a practice. It doesn't just happen. It's not magic. It's something we have to be devoted to if we want to experience it and if we want to avoid future suffering. All right, let me know if you have any questions. Have a beautiful rest of your day.